Ma'am, we're out of first-class meals. You'll have to take a sandwich." The words cut through the polished cabin like a blade. The woman in seat 2A tightened her grip on her boarding pass, lifting her gaze to meet the flight attendant's cool, dismissive eyes. "Excuse me," she said, voice steady but low. "I paid for this seat. I expect the same service as everyone else." On the cart, salmon and short ribs were still steaming, but in front of her lay only a wrapped sandwich. Conversations faltered. Silverware clinked mockingly, and the air thickened with silent judgment. She placed the sandwich on her tray with trembling fingers, the sting of humiliation sharp yet familiar, settling in her chest like a weight. Then came the faintest smile, bitter, restrained, defiant. "Fine," she whispered, her tone carrying more steel than surrender. "But I won't forget this. What happens next will change everything. Keep watching." 45 minutes earlier, Dr. Danielle Carter had walked through LAX Terminal 7 like any other traveler. Her usual armor of Armani suits and designer accessories had been replaced by a cream cardigan from Target, dark jeans, and a weathered leather bag she'd owned since business school. No jewelry except her late mother's simple gold cross. No first-class lounge access, though she owned the airline that provided it. This was her invisible CEO experiment, a strategy she'd developed to truly understand how her company treated customers when no one was watching. She'd done it at hotels, restaurants, and retail stores, always learning something that never appeared in corporate reports. But this flight was different. This was her airline, her employees, her responsibility. James Rodriguez, her vice president of operations, was already aboard, seated in business class as part of their coordinated assessment. He would observe and document from his vantage point while she experienced the service firsthand. Sarah Jenkins, the senior flight attendant, had been with National Skyways for 12 years. Her smile was practiced, professional, and utterly conditional. When Danielle presented her boarding pass, Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of doubt that Danielle had learned to recognize in countless executive meetings. "First class today?" Sarah's voice carried a subtle question mark, as if the ticket might be fraudulent. She held the boarding pass longer than necessary, examining it with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspicious documents. Danielle nodded politely. "Yes, seat 2A. Sarah's colleague, Jennifer Walsh, appeared at her shoulder. A quick exchange of glances passed between them, the kind of silent communication that happens when people believe they're sharing a joke. Jennifer's eyes swept over Danielle's appearance, lingering on the discount store cardigan and the absence of luxury accessories. "Right this way," Sarah said finally, but her tone had cooled by several degrees. No "welcome aboard," no "thank you for flying with us." None of the verbal flourishes Danielle knew were standard protocol for first-class passengers. As Danielle followed them down the jet bridge, she heard Jennifer whisper something that sounded like, "How did she afford first class?" The words were meant to be private, but Danielle's ears had been trained by decades of catching boardroom undertones and unspoken agendas. The first-class cabin was a sanctuary of cream leather and polished wood, designed to make passengers feel special from the moment they stepped inside. But as Danielle approached seat 2A, she felt none of that warmth. Instead, she sensed the subtle shift in energy that happens when people decide you don't belong. Sarah gestured toward the seat with mechanical efficiency. No offer to hang her coat, no explanation of amenities, no welcome drink. The contrast was stark when, moments later, she watched Sarah greet the white businessman in 2B with genuine warmth, immediately offering him champagne and engaging in friendly conversation about his destination. Danielle settled into her seat and opened her laptop, a modest Dell that belied the millions of dollars in company decisions it contained. She began typing, not work emails, but detailed observations. timestamps, behaviors, the kind of documentation that had served her well in 20 years of corporate leadership. Around her, the cabin filled with the privileged and powerful. Investment bankers, entertainment executives, politicians, people who looked like they belonged in first class, who moved through this space with the confidence of ownership. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps this was exactly what she needed to see. 20 minutes into the flight, Danielle still hadn't received her pre-flight beverage. She watched as Sarah and Jennifer moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, attending to every passenger except her. The man in 2B was on his second champagne. The woman across the aisle had received both nuts and a warm towel. But seat 2A remained invisible, as if surrounded by a force field of indifference. Danielle's phone was already recording. Not obviously, just positioned on her tray table, camera angled to capture the cabin interactions. She'd learned this technique from investigative journalists, the art of documenting discrimination without triggering defensive responses. "Excuse me?" she said politely when Sarah passed by for the fourth time. "Could I please have some water?" Sarah paused, her professional smile flickering like a faulty light bulb. "We're still serving other passengers. I'll get to you when I can." The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. In any customer service training manual, including National Skyway's own, this would be classified as substandard service. But Danielle remained calm, simply noting the time on her phone. 2:47 p.m. Marcus Thompson, the passenger in seat 3A, had been watching the exchange. A fellow black traveler, he understood the dynamics playing out in front of him. When Sarah walked away, he leaned forward slightly. "This is ridiculous," he said quietly to Danielle. "I've been getting the same treatment back here." Danielle nodded, filing away this confirmation. It wasn't just her, it was systematic. She opened her Instagram account and began a subtle live stream, her phone positioned to look like she was simply scrolling social media. "Flying first class today," she said softly into the camera, "and documenting the customer service experience." The viewer count was small but growing. 47 people, then 73, then 124. Jennifer Walsh noticed the phone and whispered something to Sarah. Both women glanced toward Danielle with poorly concealed annoyance. In their minds, she was probably one of those difficult passengers who complained about everything and posted negative reviews. They had no idea they were staring at the person who signed their paychecks. Sarah returned to Danielle's row, this time with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, what exactly are you doing with your phone?" "Just documenting my travel experience," Danielle replied calmly. "It's quite interesting so far." The word documenting landed like a small grenade in the conversation. In the airline industry, documentation meant complaints, lawsuits, viral videos, and corporate liability. Sarah's expression hardened, the last vestiges of professional courtesy evaporating. "We ask that passengers respect the privacy of our crew and other travelers," Sarah said, her voice carrying an edge of authority she clearly felt Danielle didn't deserve. But Danielle wasn't documenting for revenge, not yet. She was gathering evidence for the systemic changes she'd been planning since taking over as CEO 2 years ago. Changes that would ensure no passenger ever experienced what she was experiencing right now. "Of course," Danielle said agreeably, but she didn't stop recording. She simply repositioned the phone, understanding that her legal right to document her own customer experience trumped any crew member's preferences. The tension in the air was palpable now, invisible threads of conflict stretching between seat 2A and the galley where Sarah and Jennifer huddled in whispered conversation. Other passengers were beginning to notice that subtle shift in energy that happens when something goes wrong on a flight. Marcus Thompson pulled out his own phone, discreetly filming the interaction. In the age of social media, discrimination rarely happened in isolation anymore. There were witnesses, cameras, platforms for truth-telling that hadn't existed when previous generations faced these same indignities. But Sarah Jenkins was about to learn that some passengers are more dangerous than others when armed with a smartphone and a sense of justice. The meal service began at 3:15 p.m., 90 minutes into the flight. Danielle watched as Sarah and Jennifer wheeled their cart through first class, each passenger receiving the full presentation. Choice of entree, wine pairings, heated bread rolls, the theatrical flourish of premium service that justified the $1,000 fare difference. Mr. Davidson in 2B chose the seared salmon. Mrs. Williams in 1A selected the braised short ribs. Each received their meal with ceremony, the proper placement of silverware, the explanation of accompaniments, the offer of fresh ground pepper. When the cart reached seat 2A, Sarah's demeanor shifted to something approaching bureaucratic indifference. "Ma'am, we're out of first-class meals," she announced, her voice carrying enough volume to ensure nearby passengers could hear. "We only have sandwiches and water for your seat." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Danielle had counted the meals. She'd seen the cart's contents when they began service. There were plenty of entrees remaining. This wasn't an oversight or poor planning. This was deliberate exclusion dressed up as policy. Marcus Thompson immediately spoke up from behind them. "That doesn't seem right. I can see meals still on your cart." Sarah's response was swift and cutting. "Some people need to understand their place on this aircraft. We serve passengers based on priority status, and frankly, there are questions about whether this passenger belongs in first class at all." The words landed like a physical blow. Not because they hurt. Danielle had endured worse in corporate boardrooms and investment meetings, but because they revealed exactly what she'd suspected about her airline's culture. This wasn't about meal availability. This was about a black woman daring to occupy space that, in Sarah's mind, wasn't meant for her. Danielle accepted the sandwich with the kind of dignified composure that had carried her through Harvard Business School, through hostile takeover negotiations, through 20 years of being underestimated. She unwrapped the simple turkey and cheese sandwich, photographed it next to the elaborate meals surrounding her, and posted the image to her TikTok account with a simple caption. "First-class treatment. What $1,200 gets you when you don't look like the right kind of passenger." Her phone buzzed immediately with notifications. The image was being shared, commented on, dissected by thousands of people who recognized the injustice instantly. But this was just the beginning. Danielle opened her text messages and typed carefully, "Code red initiated. Flight 447, Seat 2A. Full documentation mode activated. Legal team standby, PR crisis management ready." This is not a drill. The response came within seconds. "Understood, Dr. Carter. All departments mobilized. Awaiting your signal." She looked up at Sarah, who was serving wine to the passenger across the aisle with exaggerated courtesy of performance designed to emphasize Danielle's exclusion. "You know," Danielle said quietly, her voice carrying the steel that had intimidated competitors and motivated employees for decades, "discrimination doesn't just happen in hiring offices or housing applications. It happens right here, at 35,000 feet, in spaces where people think no one important is watching." She paused, letting her words settle. "But what happens when the person you're discriminating against turns out to be the one person who can change everything?" Sarah Jenkins had reached her limit with the passenger in 2A. The constant phone use, the subtle accusations, the way this woman seemed to think she deserved the same treatment as passengers who actually belonged in first class, it all grated against Sarah's sense of order and hierarchy. She'd been flying these routes for 12 years, long enough to develop an instinct for troublemakers. "Ma'am, I need you to stop recording immediately," Sarah said, positioning herself directly in front of Danielle's seat with the kind of authority she'd learned to project when dealing with difficult passengers. "You're disrupting flight operations and making other passengers uncomfortable." Danielle looked up from her phone, her expression remaining remarkably calm. I'm documenting my customer service experience. I believe that's within my rights as a paying passenger. Not when it violates the privacy of crew members and creates a disturbance, Sarah shot back. She pulled out the aircraft phone and spoke loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Captain Davidson, we have a disruptive passenger in 2A making false accusations and refusing to comply with crew instructions. The word disruptive was carefully chosen airline code for a passenger who might need to be removed from the aircraft. It was a threat wrapped in procedure, designed to intimidate Danielle into compliance. Jennifer Walsh appeared at Sarah's shoulder, adding her voice to the confrontation. These people always think they're being discriminated against, she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. They see racism in everything, even normal service procedures. The phrase "these people" landed like a slap across the cabin. Several passengers looked up from their meals and entertainment systems, suddenly aware that something significant was happening in their midst. Marcus Thompson stood up from his seat, his patience finally exhausted. Excuse me, but I've been watching this entire interaction, and what you're doing is absolutely unacceptable. Sir, please return to your seat, Sarah commanded, but her authority was beginning to crack. Two passengers were now actively challenging her, and the situation was escalating beyond her ability to control. The confrontation was no longer contained to seat 2A. Passengers throughout the first-class cabin had stopped eating, stopped reading, stopped pretending they weren't witnessing something that would haunt their social media feeds for weeks to come. The cabin had divided into three camps: those who supported the crew, those who supported Danielle, and those who simply wanted the drama to end. "She's being completely dramatic," said Mrs. Patterson from seat 3B, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Why can't she just be grateful for the accommodation they've made?" "Grateful?" Marcus Thompson's voice rose in disbelief. "She paid for a first-class ticket and received a gas station sandwich. How is that an accommodation?" But Mrs. Patterson had allies. Mr. Williams from 1B nodded approvingly. "Some passengers think they can intimidate the crew with cameras and accusations. It's disgraceful behavior." The cabin was becoming a microcosm of America itself, divided along lines of race, class, and perspective, with each side absolutely certain of their moral authority. Danielle's TikTok live stream had exploded. The viewer count climbed past 5,000, then 10,000. Comments flooded in. "This is disgusting. Sue them. Get their names. Contact the CEO." The irony of that last comment wasn't lost on Danielle. She opened her Twitter account and posted a thread. "Flying at National Skyways first class today. Paid $1,200 for a seat, received a turkey sandwich while watching other passengers enjoy full meals. When I asked why, was told some people need to understand their place." Let's discuss what place means in 2024. The tweet began spreading immediately. Retweets, quote tweets, replies from journalists, activists, and ordinary travelers who'd experienced similar treatment. Within minutes, hashtag National Skyways discrimination was trending in Los Angeles, then California, then nationwide. Jennifer Walsh noticed the phone activity and panic flashed across her face. "She's posting about us online," she whispered urgently to Sarah. "This could go viral." But it was already too late for damage control. Captain Mike Davidson emerged from the cockpit with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to being the final authority on his aircraft. At 52, with silver hair and the confident bearing of 25 years in commercial aviation, Davidson had dealt with every type of passenger crisis imaginable. In his mind, this was simply another case of someone trying to use social media to extract concessions from the airline. He was wrong. "Ma'am," he said, standing over Danielle's seat with practiced authority, "you're creating a disturbance on my aircraft. I need you to stop recording immediately and comply with crew instructions, or we'll be making an emergency landing to have you removed." The threat was nuclear. An emergency landing would inconvenience hundreds of passengers, cost the airline tens of thousands of dollars, and generate exactly the kind of negative publicity airlines feared most. It was a bluff, but Davidson delivered it with the conviction of someone who'd never been challenged by a passenger. Danielle looked up at him with the kind of calm that comes from sitting through hostile board meetings and congressional hearings. "Captain, I'm simply documenting my customer service experience. I haven't violated any federal aviation regulations, and I've complied with all safety instructions." "Some passengers," Davidson said, his voice carrying throughout the first-class cabin, "think they can intimidate our crew with cameras and false accusations of discrimination. Let me be clear. That behavior will not be tolerated on my aircraft." His words were meant to establish dominance, to remind everyone who held power at 35,000 feet. But they also created something else, a permanent record of his dismissal of discrimination claims, captured by multiple phones and broadcast to thousands of viewers. Danielle felt the familiar surge of controlled anger that had fueled her rise through corporate America. She'd been called uppity, difficult, and aggressive for decades, usually by men who looked exactly like Captain Davidson. She reached for her phone and sent a carefully crafted message. "Emergency board meeting activated. Legal team full deployment. PR crisis management, level 5. Media statement prepared. This is not a drill, repeat, not a drill." The response was immediate. "All departments mobilized, Dr. Carter, awaiting your authorization to proceed." Davidson was still talking, explaining airline policy and passenger obligations, unaware that he was speaking to the person who could end his career with a single text message. "You know, Captain," Danielle said quietly, her voice cutting through his monologue with surgical precision, "there's an interesting dynamic happening here. You're threatening to emergency land this aircraft because a paying passenger documented receiving inferior service. That suggests you're more concerned with hiding the problem than solving it." She paused, letting her words register with the audience of passengers and crew members who were hanging on every syllable. "But I suppose we'll see who really has authority on this aircraft, won't we?" The moment arrived with the sharp trill of Danielle's phone. She glanced at the caller ID, then looked up at Captain Davidson with a smile that contained 20 years of suppressed responses to men who'd underestimated her. "Dr. Carter?" The voice on speakerphone was clear enough for half the cabin to hear. "This is Board Chairman Richardson. The emergency session is convened and ready for your briefing regarding the Flight 447 incident." The first-class cabin fell into the kind of silence that precedes avalanches. Sarah Jenkins's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, recognition, then pure terror, as the implications began to settle. "Carter? Dr. Carter?" she whispered, the words barely audible. But Danielle wasn't finished. "James?" She called toward the business class section, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. James Rodriguez, National Skyways Vice President of Operations, appeared from seat 7A, where he'd been sitting throughout the entire ordeal, watching, documenting, gathering the evidence that would reshape the airline's training programs forever. "Yes, Dr. Carter?" His appearance sent another shockwave through the cabin. Passengers who'd been filming pulled out their phones again, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Captain Davidson's face had gone ashen. "Dr. Carter? I'm Dr. Danielle Carter," she said, standing with the fluid grace of someone who'd commanded boardrooms from coast to coast. "Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of National Skyways. And I've just experienced firsthand exactly how my airline treats passengers who look like me." The revelation hit the cabin like a decompression event. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been criticizing Danielle moments earlier, suddenly found her champagne glass fascinating. Mr. Williams stared at his laptop screen as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Sarah Jenkins appeared to be having difficulty breathing. I didn't know. I'm so sorry." I had no idea. Exactly, Danielle said, her voice carrying the steel that had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions and faced down hostile investors. You had no idea. That's precisely the problem. Marcus Thompson began applauding slow, deliberate claps that built into genuine appreciation. Dr. Carter, that was masterful. But Danielle wasn't done. She turned to address the entire cabin, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades speaking to rooms full of people who initially doubted her right to be there. For 2 years, I've been hearing reports about inconsistent service, about passengers feeling unwelcome on our aircraft. Today, I experienced it myself. This wasn't about meal availability or passenger status. This was about assumptions, dangerous, discriminatory assumptions about who belongs in premium cabins. She gestured toward her simple clothes, her modest appearance. I deliberately dress this way to understand how my airline treats customers when they think no one important is watching. What I discovered is that we have work to do. Captain Davidson tried to speak, but Danielle continued. I didn't reveal my identity to embarrass anyone. I revealed it because discrimination thrives in darkness, and sunshine remains the best disinfectant. The cabin erupted in a mixture of applause, nervous laughter, and the furious tapping of phones as passengers rushed to update their social media accounts with the most dramatic plot twist in commercial aviation history. Jennifer Walsh was crying quietly, understanding that her career had just ended with spectacular publicity. James Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression professional but grim. Dr. Carter, should I begin the immediate review process? Yes, Danielle said simply. Full investigation, complete documentation, and implementation of the new training protocols we discussed last month. She looked around the cabin one final time, her gaze settling on each person who'd witnessed this transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just participated in an unscheduled but necessary lesson about dignity, respect, and the power of accountability. I hope it's been educational. The wheels of national skyways, Flight 447 had barely touched the tarmac at JFK when the consequences began cascading through the corporate structure like dominoes falling in precise sequence. Dr. Danielle Carter's phone buzzed with a text from her general counsel. Full legal team assembled. HR director standing by. Media relations prepared for immediate response. Awaiting your green light. She typed back, execute immediately. Zero tolerance protocol. Within 3 hours of landing, Sarah Jenkins received a call that would end her aviation career. Effective immediately, your employment with National Skyways is terminated for gross violation of company policy regarding discrimination and passenger treatment. The HR director's voice was professional but final. Your behavior has been documented, witnessed, and recorded. You will not be eligible for rehire, and we will be providing factual references to any future employers who inquire. Jennifer Walsh faced the same fate, her 12-year career ending with a termination letter that cited conduct incompatible with National Skyways' values of equality and respect for all passengers. Captain Davidson's fall was more spectacular. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an immediate investigation into his threat to emergency land the aircraft for non-safety reasons. Within a week, his pilot's license was suspended pending a full review. The suspension would last 18 months, during which he would be required to complete extensive training on unconscious bias and professional conduct. We can't have pilots who threaten emergency landings because passengers document poor service, the FAA investigator explained to the aviation press. That represents a fundamental misunderstanding of both safety protocols and passenger rights. But the individual consequences were just the beginning. National Skyways stock opened Monday morning down 12%, wiping out $2.8 billion in market value as investors absorbed the implications of a CEO experiencing discrimination on her own airline. By Tuesday, The drop had reached 18%. This isn't just about bad PR, financial analyst Rebecca Morrison explained on CNBC. This reveals systemic problems in corporate culture that could expose the airline to massive legal liability. The social media storm was unprecedented. National Skyways discrimination generated over 2 million posts in 48 hours. Passengers shared their own experiences of differential treatment, creating a digital paper trail of discriminatory behavior that stretched back years. Civil rights organizations seized the moment. Dr. Carter's experience demonstrates that discrimination in premium services remains a pervasive problem, said Marcus Williams, president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. If a CEO can be treated this way, imagine what ordinary passengers endure. James Rodriguez, promoted to Chief Operating Officer in the restructuring that followed, announced sweeping changes, mandatory unconscious bias training for all customer-facing employees, secret shopper programs to monitor service quality, and a new zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Dr. Carter's courage in documenting this experience has given us the opportunity to become the airline we've always claimed to be, Rodriguez announced at a press conference. Excellence in service means excellence for everyone, regardless of appearance, race, or preconceptions about who belongs in our premium cabins. The transformation was swift and merciless. Sarah Jenkins found herself unemployable in the airline industry, her name forever associated with the most public discrimination scandal in aviation history. Captain Davidson, once a respected pilot with a spotless record, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption and prejudice. But Dr. Carter wasn't finished. 3 weeks after Flight 447, Dr. Danielle Carter sat across from Anderson Cooper in CNN's New York studios, her composure as unshakable as it had been at 35,000 feet. "Dr. Carter," Cooper began, "you could have simply revealed your identity immediately and avoided the entire confrontation. Why didn't you?" Danielle's answer came with the measured cadence of someone who'd spent considerable time thinking about leadership and responsibility. "Anderson, I didn't do this because I'm a CEO. I did this for every black passenger, every person of color, every individual who's experienced this treatment without having a voice, without having power, without having the platform to create change." She paused, letting her words settle. "Dignity shouldn't depend on your job title, your bank account, or whether people recognize your name. Every person who pays for a service deserves to receive that service with respect. That's not a privilege, that's basic human decency." Cooper leaned forward. "Some critics have said your response was disproportionate, that you destroyed careers over what they call a minor service issue." Danielle's laugh was soft but carried steel underneath. "Minor? Anderson, when my flight attendant told me some people need to understand their place, that wasn't about meal service. That was about the belief that certain people who look like me, don't belong in premium spaces." She shifted in her chair, her voice gaining intensity without losing its control. "I've sat in boardrooms where I was the only woman, the only person of color, listening to executives discuss diversity initiatives while treating their own employees and customers with exactly the bias they claimed to oppose. This wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability." The interview had been watched by 4.2 million people live, with clips shared across every social platform. But it was her final statement that resonated most deeply with viewers. "When we change how businesses treat customers, we're changing society," she said, looking directly into the camera. "Every time someone stands up to discrimination, they're making it easier for the next person to be treated with dignity. That's not corporate responsibility, that's human responsibility." The response was overwhelming. Letters poured into National Skyways from passengers sharing their own experiences, thanking Dr. Carter for giving voice to treatment they'd endured in silence. Flight attendants from other airlines reached out privately, describing similar patterns of discrimination they'd witnessed but felt powerless to address. Harvard Business School added her handling of the crisis to their leadership curriculum. Dr. Carter demonstrated that authentic leadership means being willing to experience your organization from the perspective of those with the least power, Professor Sarah Martinez explained to her students. She didn't just talk about equality, she subjected herself to inequality to understand it. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Marcus Thompson, the passenger who'd supported her during the flight. He sent a handwritten letter. Dr. Carter, watching you handle that situation with such grace and strength reminded me why I teach my daughters that dignity can never be taken away, it can only be given away. Thank you for not giving yours away. 6 months after Flight 447, Dr. Danielle Carter stood before a packed auditorium at the National Business Leadership Conference, delivering the keynote address that would be quoted, shared, and remembered for years to come. You have a choice, she told the audience of executives, entrepreneurs, and business leaders. You can choose silence when you witness injustice, or you can choose to become the voice for yourself and others who can't speak up. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd proven that individual action could create systemic change. Every time you stand up for what's right, every time you refuse to accept that's just how things are, you're creating the world our children deserve to inherit. You're writing the story of what American business can become when it lives up to its highest ideals. The audience was riveted, but Dr. Carter wasn't finished. I want you to remember something. I didn't change national skyways by filing a complaint or hiring lawyers or threatening litigation. I changed it by documenting truth, sharing that truth, and refusing to accept treatment that violated basic human dignity. She gestured toward the audience. Each of you has that same power. You have phones that can record discrimination. You have social media platforms that can amplify voices. You have purchasing power that can reward businesses that do right and punish those that don't. The speech had been live-streamed to 200,000 viewers, but it was her closing challenge that generated the most response. I challenge you to become secret shoppers for equality. Experience businesses as they really are, not as they present themselves to people they think matter. Document what you find. Share what you discover. Support companies that treat all customers with dignity and hold accountable those that don't. She paused for effect, her smile carrying both warmth and warning. Because here's what I learned at 35,000 feet. When people show you who they really are, believe them. When businesses show you their true values, believe them. And when you have the power to demand better, use it. Marcus Thompson had become an unlikely activist, creating the hashtag Passenger Dignity movement that monitored airline service across racial and economic lines. His documentation had led to policy changes at 3 major carriers. Dr. Carter showed us that change doesn't require position or authority, he told reporters. It requires courage and the willingness to make truth visible. The movement had grown beyond aviation. Passengers documented treatment at luxury hotels, high-end restaurants, exclusive retail stores, creating a network of accountability that forced businesses to examine their own biases. Dr. Carter's final words to the conference became the movement's unofficial motto. Remember this, class is about character, not cabin. Respect is earned through actions, not assumptions. And dignity never goes out of style. She smiled, the same calm smile she'd worn while accepting a turkey sandwich in first class. But discrimination? Well, that can cost you everything. The audience erupted in applause that lasted 4 minutes, but the real measure of her impact wasn't in the auditorium. It was in the thousands of passengers who'd learned that they had power, that they had voice, and that sometimes the most important battles for justice happen in the most ordinary moments. Sarah Jenkins had become a cautionary tale, her name synonymous with the dangers of assumption and prejudice. Captain Davidson's career had ended not with a dramatic crash, but with the quiet recognition that his attitudes had no place in modern aviation. But Dr. Danielle Carter? She had become something more than a CEO. She had become proof that dignity, when defended with courage and intelligence, could move mountains, even at 35,000 feet.